And here we are. All right, folks, welcome to the third virtual Wells College Visiting Writers Series event of the fall 2020 semester. I am Dan Rosenberg, the director of the series, and as always, I want to begin by thanking NYSCA, the New York State Council for the Arts, for their generous support, which the Visiting Writers Series has benefited from for many years, and we're grateful to them for that. For tonight's reading, the audience will be muted as you are now, but there is a chat option, and how we've done it in the past, I think successfully, is to ask people to write questions or comments in the chat, and at natural breaks in Meredith's reading, I will unmute myself to sort of pose your questions to her. So please feel free to use that chat to react to specific moments or to ask something that you think others might want to hear from Meredith about. And then at the end of the reading, there'll be time for more formal Q&A, during which we can just unmute if you want to use the raise hand feature. That will be easy, or if we're a small enough group like Meredith suggested, maybe we can just have it be a free-for-all. We'll see. That's my sort of logistical opening, and now I get to enjoy the rare treat of not having to perform so much at these things, because Bob Prohl, our last visiting writer, has asked for the honor of introducing Meredith to you all. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and then Meredith will take over, and I will pop back in at the end. Cool? All right, please take it away, Bob.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm very excited to introduce Meredith Allison, someone I've known for quite a while, since her time in Ithaca. Meredith is an author, journalist, and editor whose work about sex, gender, queer and trans issues, labor, and politics has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, in Self, in Vice, and in too many other outlets to name. She is the founding executive editor of Them, a major outlet for LGBTQ+ voices. Her memoir, Fairest, begins with her childhood as a boy in the Philippines, set apart as much by her intellectual curiosity as by the paleness of her skin. As Talusan moves from a small village in Manila to Manila to Harvard, Fairest calls on the reader to reevaluate ideas of gender, sexuality, race, and nationality as one by one it upends and rearranges them. I was an outcast among outcasts, she writes, and her position on the edges of queer communities, artistic communities, academic communities, and activist communities allows her to cast a spotlight into them, showing their strengths as well as their fissures. Talusan's prose grounds us in image and in physicality. Great books speak to us about what it is like to be a person in the world, and Fairest does one better. It reckons with the problem of what it's like to be a person in a body, to be perceived by yourself and by others, how those readings shift, and how we can affect those shifts with an ability to move between and across binaries. Poet and novelist Ocean Vuong calls Fairest a ball of light hurled into the dark undertow of migration and survival. And there is a brightness to the book, the flair of its sunchild narrator, leaving lasting after images on the reader's perception and understanding. It is my honor to introduce to you guys Meredith Allison.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's such a wonderful introduction. And yeah, you know, like we knew each other as kids, just playing around with words and it's, I'm sure it's strange for you. I mean, I think it's strange for everybody. You know, the ways in which we sort of like move through the world and inhabit the world. And I think, while Bob knew each other at Cornell, that was sort of a quiet time for me in terms of, in terms of all of these issues. I wasn't particularly out. I was only out to close friends while I was in grad school there. You're probably hearing my dog in the background. That's Ronnie. So I am going, what I'm going to do is I actually have not done kind of like a long reading. So, it feels like a luxury to be able to read to you for about 30 minutes before, we get to talk to each other. So what I decided to do is to read the prologue, and hopefully the whole first chapter. We'll see um, how long that takes, because I think it'll give you a sense of the book, of the way that it travels through time, of the way that it moves through different spaces while I'm experiencing myself as different identities. So I'm just going to start from the beginning. And while this is a big irony, actually, as an albino person, I have my book, but I actually cannot read it physically unless you don't see this, but I have a screen reader. So I am using my iPad to read my book. Although there's a large print edition that I'm apparently going to get soon, but I haven't gotten it yet. So let me just grab it. Okay. Prologue. Bridges of light. Red brick, white tent, green grass, the outlines of prestige at an inner courtyard on a drizzly day. That was what I saw, the same as what I remembered, the specifics fuzzy from afar, my albino eyes only able to render life in scant detail unless I held it close. But I couldn't well squat down to examine those blades of grass under my feet as I entered the cover of that tent, not at a reunion reception for queer students at Harvard, whether at that moment in 2017 or when I graduated in 1997. I couldn't reveal myself a freak, especially not in this crowd, which would damn me for my failure of sight. I arrived at this reception from New York, passing several bodies of water by train, but somehow the Charles still stood out to me when I took the T from South Station, the vast expanse of it, the first substantial body of water I crossed after the Pacific Ocean, when I left the pain of my childhood and hurtled to a future of great promise. This is a memory I could only vaguely make out from that distance of time, though I was used to the feeling, since my physical vision could never represent anything far except as blurs. My way of seeing had advantages, though. Since I couldn't perceive detail from far away, I could more easily associate what I saw with my past, like how those language philosophers say that when a person hears the word chair, they picture an idealized chair in their mind, drawn from an amalgam of memories. My vision was like that all the time, except it absorbed the few details I could actually see and integrated them with the objects I imagined. Unable to identify any specific blade of grass on this occasion, I could imagine the blurry mass under my feet as the same uniform stalks of verdant green I'd stepped on 20 years earlier, and so became two people without much effort, the person who arrived today and the young man from the afternoon of my improbable graduation from the most prestigious university in the world. Me, a child from a Philippine province, descendant of peasant farmers, son of derelict immigrants. Except I was no longer a son, no longer a man. I became more aware of this as groups of gay men, mostly aging or aged, circulated around me. Their manner of casual evaluation was all too familiar from the countless gay occasions I'd been exposed to: clubs, parties, rallies, meetings, events where official interactions were always tinged with the energy of male desire. Though having such blurry vision made me pay closer attention to what I could perceive, and what I saw was the change in how those men approached and retreated, the way their bodies created invisible patterns in space, the distinction between being observed but found wanting and being dismissed offhand, the difference between being a not so hot guy and a woman. It's kind of fun to see a bunch of boys who rejected me under the same tent, a droll voice behind me said, whose owner I immediately identified as Kit Clark, a Black alum who was several classes ahead of me, but had worked at Harvard after graduation and never left. We got back in touch a few years earlier, so he's one of the few people I'd seen since I finished college. Haven't snagged one yet? I asked as I turned to face him. It's a lot worse than when you were here, he replied. The men keep getting younger, and I'm only getting uglier. I would protest if it were anyone else, but Kit's tone had always made it clear that he did not invite praise whenever he said something negative about his appearance. What he invited was empathy, agreement with the injustice of how looks so determined our place in the gay pecking order, and how our lack of attractiveness had so much to do with our race and femininity. Kit's broad open face, his strong jaw, his wide nose, would not be considered ugly if not for the kinky hair he kept long. His olive skin would have also been attractive, except that it didn't come with the hypermasculinity that seemed to be a prerequisite for Black gay men to be thought hot. Instead, Kit refused to subject his tall, lanky frame to the rigors of a gym regimen and preferred activities like circus silks and modern dance, which he could perform with a lithe grace. You can always leave Cambridge, I suggested. You're not serious. My life is here. I accept that I'm undesirable. This struck me as a fundamental difference between us, and why I'd kept my friendship with Kit at arm's length over the years, because his self-acceptance rattled me. Kit would not allow himself to butch it up or keep his hair short just to court suitors. He wanted to be wanted, but he wouldn't compromise himself for the sake of another's desire. I, on the other hand, didn't have the same solid sense of self. I'd been more than willing to clamp down on my most undesirable traits, especially 2 decades ago, when I had such an unclear sense of who I was beyond other people's reflections of me. At the same time, Kit recognized long before I did how alike we were, that we both occupied liminal spaces in our white-dominated Harvard gay society. He recognized me as an albino Asian when everyone else thought I was white. He could tell that my workout regimen was cover for a femininity I obscured because it was not attractive. He could also tell that someone needed to see the reality of me, even when I took such pains to hide it. And Kit generously gave my inner self a witness, even when I could never settle for long under his glare. Kit motioned to someone who approached us, and when he got close, I surprised myself when I recognized Sean Chambers, an English lit grad student while I was in college. His appearance had not changed much, just a few pounds and a widow's peak, his red hair duller than I remembered. I'm Meredith, I said. I remember you, he replied. I couldn't tell whether he'd learned about my transition through the grapevine or if he was just good at going with the flow. That the change between old and new me wasn't as drastic as it used to be. I cut my hair in a bob and was not wearing makeup, had on a loose gray jumpsuit that could be feasibly worn by a man or a woman. Do you recognize anyone else? I asked. Sean motioned with his head toward a man passing by in tight jeans and a white shirt under his blazer. The man's tan skin seemed leathery to me, even from a distance, his hair equal parts pepper and salt. Vince Parker. I had a crush on him, Sean said. He was so hot. Everyone had a crush on him, Kit rejoined. As Kit and Sean gossiped about how attractive Vince had been, I reflected on the word was. I imagined the man would feel hurt to be spoken of like this, his beauty in the past tense. Anyway, we all get older and uglier, Kit concluded. Except for Meredith, Sean said as he turned to me. You look the same. Isn't it weird, Kit observed, how she changed genders and looks more like she did 20 years ago than any of us? It's the Asian genes. I chuckled then. I used to look really different when I wore heels, dresses, and a full face of makeup nearly every day. But as I put more and more of my thoughts out into the world, I also grew wary of the need to conform to that world's expectations of me. So the heels came off, then the makeup, then the girly clothes, until I was left presenting myself in much the same way I did before transition, except hormones had given me breasts that allowed people to identify me as female. Though I hope my belief in my own womanhood also came across, regardless of how I looked. When I noticed a break in the drizzle, I walked away from the Lowell House courtyard where the reception was, across Massachusetts Avenue, and back to Adam's house, where Harvard was housing me for the weekend. A concrete gargoyle whose mouth opened out onto a small fountain, long out of use, greeted me before I opened the heavy carved door to my old undergrad dorm. This grandness was a remnant of a time when Adams was known as the Gold Coast Apartments, housing for the richest among Harvard men. I walked down the marble-tiled hallway to the room I'd been assigned, its door also heavy as I opened it, with a ceiling at least 11 feet high and a giant fireplace whose marble mantle reached above my head. It was next door to FDR's old room back when he himself was a Harvard man, which alumni of the house had lovingly restored with Persian rugs and period furniture. My own room was barren, except for the same oak table and dresser from 20 years ago, the same chair upholstered a pale teal, with legs that connected and curved in the back, the better to tip it upward in a precarious balance while lost in contemplation, as I often did when I lived in Adams. I spied the same single mattress from my college days when I opened the door to the bedroom on a frame with a headboard made of black metal that vaguely reminded me of prison bars. A clear plastic bag with sheets and a towel lay on top of it, which only amplified the prison effect. Ironic, given how it was my younger brother who went to jail my senior year, a fact I barely registered through the haze of classes and finals. I went in and was about to put sheets on the bed when my eye caught a white glint, and I turned to face my reflection against the mirror through the open bathroom door, which I knew was the same kind of mirror from 20 years ago, even when it was blurry, a shallow, vertical rectangle, its corners rounded. As for the reflection itself, I could only really see the shape of my head from that distance, the yellow outline of my blonde hair, the entire reflection brighter on the side closest to the window, receding to near blackness at the lower left corner. I remembered a game I used to play with myself when I saw my reflection from afar. About 12 feet away, I couldn't make out the details of my face, could only glean the fuzzy outlines of my eyes and lips, the holes of my nostrils, as the rest of my features blended with my skin. From that distance, I could only imagine what my face would really look like when I got closer. The words, "You look the same," lingered in my mind, and I wondered whether I could imagine myself with a man's face, knowing that for many years now, I only saw a woman's face when I looked in the mirror, and it had taken so much sacrifice to bring that reflection into being. I still got plenty of comments online that I looked like a man, insults I brushed off because I trusted my own perception over anyone else's. It felt perverse, even dangerous to bring my old face back, the man I used to be. But I wanted to prove to myself that I could recall my old face without shaking my confidence in my womanhood. The more my skin prickled at the thought of imagining myself as a man, instead of a woman like before, or a white American instead of an albino Filipino before that, the more I wanted to play that game again. Being in that room, in that place where I had spent so much time as a man, I wondered if I could recover my old self, at least for a moment. I faced the mirror and imagined my prominent brow, my angular jaw, my flat chin, the features that made me fear I would always be perceived as a man when I started to transition. I took one step toward that mirror, and then another, when I noticed that my jaw was no longer so sharply angled, as fat had settled on that part of my face and turned what was once a line into a shallow curve. Another step, and I noticed my rosy cheeks. Another, the natural pucker of my lips. So by the time I got close and leaned against the sink, I found myself unable to maintain the sensation that this face was a man's, or that I, by extension, was a man, even when I understood what Sean meant when he said that I looked the same, my essential features more like they were 20 years ago than the other people at that reception. None of the reflections from outside could unmoor my own perception of myself, one that I'd honed and maintained over many years, like a delicate, well tended plant. I hardened the muscles on my face, furrowed my brow, and clenched my lips into a hard line so I would look more like a man, though the impression I got was not of a man, but of a woman pretending to be a man, and not very well, as my features softened back to their original expression. This reminded me of how, after I learned to speak with an American accent and tried to get back my old Filipino one with its hard consonants and sing song intonation, it always felt like I was making fun of the accent, even though it was the one I grew up with. I also couldn't manage to use the accent in daily life because it reminded me too much of being made fun of, being thought less because I came to high school in America speaking that way. Maybe my mind also protected me from my male past, as I gave up and accepted that I could no longer perceive myself as a man or harden my features to look like one. I wondered to what degree the image in front of me conform to what was real. But as soon as I wondered this, I also reminded myself that there is no single objective truth, how reality is so much more malleable than people make it out to be, that the first step in making something real is believing that it could be real, that my very presence in front of this mirror, in this school, in the world, was itself proof of the power of belief in a reality that seemed entirely far-fetched. So the mirror was just a mirror now, the reflection of a reality I myself perceived, that I was a woman. But as soon as I understood this, I also understood that the reality of my race was even more embedded, how I imagined myself as a white American for so long that I didn't even need to try to conjure an image of myself as an albino Filipino to know that I couldn't, because I'd relied on my image as a white person for even longer than I had as a woman. Even though I knew I was albino and lived with the sensory reality of poor vision and the palest skin, I perceived myself to be a white person of European descent when I looked in the mirror. I relied on that perception to bolster my belief that I could do well in America, that I was better than the brown rural peasants I left behind. For most of my existence, mirrors were not just mirrors to me, but bridges made of light to fantastic destinations where I would be different than myself and lead a better life. If the other side of the mirror was another world, then my imagination was the vehicle that could take me there. In that dimly lit bathroom, I came to acknowledge that I was no longer at my place of origin, but at my destination, the world I determined for myself I would someday reach, and that my imagination had successfully taken me there, a place where passing had transformed into being. But having arrived, it turned out my imagination did not have the fuel to take me back. The journey to this world I now inhabited was a one-way trip. I touched the mirror and felt the truth of its material surface, how it was a piece of glass with beveled edges, coated in silver that had oxidized in places, creating black spots like little islands on the edges of the frame. It was eerie to be on the other side of that glass, when I once stared at my reflection in a mirror, so much like this one, and believed I could never become the beautiful woman in my fantasies. Then I remembered that I'd already crossed one bridge toward whiteness and its advantages, including an education I could have never imagined possible had I been the color I was meant to be. We were going to pause. Oops, sorry. I just dropped my books, but we were going to pause for discussion or questions right after a section.
Yeah. And I will invite people to go ahead and drop them in the chat, or if you want to just use the raise hand feature, that would also be fine, given what an intimate sort of space we are here. And in the pause, I would actually ask a question of my own, which is when in the writing process for this memoir, did you decide to include this prologue? Like, this takes place 20 years after graduating from college, so
Yeah.
So very much in the future chronologically for the rest of the memoir. When did you why did you decide to start there, and when did that decision happen for you in the process?
I always knew that there was going to be a prologue because I just felt like it was important for people to know upfront that it was going to be a story that involved a bunch of intersectional identities, right? That if I started off, if I started the first chapter being an albino child in the Philippines, people would just think, oh, this is a memoir about an albino person, because that in itself is already unusual, right? One could write a memoir as a whole memoir about as an albino person. So I knew that it was important. It was also really important to me that race and gender be, deeply implicated with each other. And I couldn't, I couldn't write that without writing a prologue. But I wrote probably at least 6 different ones. I wrote one reflecting on Rachel Dolezal after I wrote this sort of viral op-ed, Guardian op-ed about her. I wrote one that was set on like the top floor of One World Trade Center when I became executive editor at Condé Nast, right? You know, kind of like similar themes of achievement, et cetera, et cetera. But then when I went to Reunion, you know, and I reflected upon it, I was just like, oh, you know, like that's, reunions are the place where people compare, you know, who they are now with the people that they were then. And so it was just like a really, you know, like that was a very organic way to introduce the topic. And also, you know, like, and also Sean very conveniently said, and a lot of people at Reunion were just like, it's very confusing that you look the same. Like, we know that you're like, it's like 12th Night. You're sort of like you're like the Viola version of yourself. And we were, you know, interacting with Sebastian the whole time. Especially because my hair was short when I was at Reunion. So it was just like a very, yeah, like it was a very interesting occasion to reflect. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts before I continue?
Yeah, we have a question from Courtney, who has been a delightful, frequent alumna contributor to these events. Hi, Courtney. And she asked, do you keep journals? And if yes, when did you start, and did you use them as points of reference while writing? And if not, how do you remind yourself of so many sensory details of memory?
I do keep journals, but I haven't kept them systematically. So there were definitely like big gaps in terms of, and they took different forms, right? Like I had a live journal, I had a blogger, I have, you know, like physical journals. But I think ultimately for me, my process, and I think part of it is, you know, like I've done investigative journalism, and when I'm in investigative journalist mode, I'm like super factual and very dogged, and it's just like, okay, like what are the facts? Let me get to the, you know, like actual, you know, sort of like deep factual reality of what I'm reporting on. Whereas I think for a memoir, I think in certain ways, like what you misremember is sometimes more important than what the actual truth is, because what you misremember is the thing that actually affected you, like regardless of whether or not the memory is actually true, right? So my process was sort of intentionally unsystematic, in part because I didn't want to get into that fact-finding mode. I wanted to get into the mode of, you know, like of how the events that I actually remember are affecting me. Another thing that I actually talked about in the masterclass is that you know, like even if I barely remember something, as long as I know it's significant, I try to write a scene about it. And if I can't remember the details in that scene, I make details up. And then in the process of making details up, as I'm editing, I'm just like, no, that's wrong. Like it can't, you know, like that couldn't have happened that way. And so like having this sort of like frame of reference really helps me actually like unearth more truths and more details. And also, it's also good in terms of like checking with people, right? You know, like this is how I remember things, you know, how do you remember them, et cetera, et cetera. So should I continue?
Yes, please.
All right. So this is the second section of the prologue. It looks like we'll have time for the two sections of the prologue and the first section of the first chapter, which covers present, Harvard, and childhood very conveniently. All right. It was sophomore year, the Saturday before Halloween, 1994. I ended up on the top floor of the furthest entryway in Adam's house, which I didn't mind because the eaves made my room feel like a garret. I'd recently learned that word at a lecture on Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, where the professor proposed the garret as an ideal space for writers in search of quiet and contemplation. I felt inspired in that room, even though I occasionally bumped my head when I sat up in bed. I'd skipped breakfast that day, so it was past noon by the time I shuffled into the dining hall. I hoped to see people I recognized after I got food, but when I didn't, I sat alone at one of the square tables in the middle of that vast space, with its dark wood paneling and red velvet curtains, hoping still that someone I knew would come along and join me. I'd only lived in the house for 6 weeks and was slow to make friends. At the next table, I overheard some juniors I didn't know well talking about drag night, an Adams tradition I'd heard about but didn't realize was happening over dinner that evening. They were planning to do a number to It's Raining Men. We need to get to the thrift store to get costumes, a compact blonde man named Zach said. And he needs to shave, a redheaded girl named Sarah commented. I sneaked a peek to see who she was talking about, someone whose name I didn't know, who had dark curly hair and patches of stubble. It'll be funnier if I don't shave, the guy said, who I immediately assumed was straight. I wondered if I should ask to join their group, but I couldn't rely on them not to laugh in my face or make excuses not to let me in. Anyway, just because I was gay didn't mean I should automatically do drag. I'd never dressed in women's clothes before, not even in private or, for that matter, gone out in costume for Halloween, since we didn't have Halloween in the Philippines. No one at lunch seemed interested in talking to me anyway, in asking me anyway. I walked over to the mailboxes after my meal and ran into a girl I'd gotten friendly with the day I moved in, another sophomore named Lucy Bisugnano. So, she began, what are you doing for drag night? Just watching. You have to at least dress up. Come over to my room. I have dresses that would probably fit you. I agreed to meet Lucy later that afternoon. Though I was excited to wear women's clothes for the first time, I was even more thrilled that someone at Harvard cared enough to hang out with me, especially someone as popular as Lucy, small-boned and fine-featured, yet unfailingly jovial, like a bird in mid-flight. I was a poor kid who'd gone to a mediocre public school in Chino, California, in the smoggy, working-class part of Los Angeles, where my uncle worked as a nurse. So that was where we ended up when my family immigrated 4 years earlier. My brain and my will got me to Harvard, but I didn't want to be the poor immigrant kid once I got there. I pretended to be like everyone else, did a good enough job with my accent to pass for white and native born, but not a good enough job that I could keep other kids from thinking I was weird. Hardly anyone wanted to be my friend, and the few who did, I didn't really care for, not until Lucy came along. A couple of hours before dinner and the drag night festivities, I knocked on the door of Lucy's suite, and she led me through the halogen-lit common room into her bedroom, where Monet and Degas posters livened up the beige walls. Her room barely fit her desk and single bed, which suited me fine because I liked being near her. I'm not sure what will fit you, so let me just show you what I have. As I sat on Lucy's bed, on a comforter adorned with tiny pink flowers I couldn't identify, maybe peonies or gardenias, she opened her closet door and pulled out dresses on hangers one by one, then draped them in front of her. I wanted to examine the details of those garments, admire the lace pattern of one and the pleating of another, but I would have needed to get really close, and it felt too early to expose my poor vision to my new friend. But she must have sensed a heightened reaction when she showed me a sleeveless dress made of black velvet, a fabric I immediately identified because its shade was darker than any other cloth, a depth of color I hadn't known back home. I bet this would look good against your skin, Lucy said. She left the room so I could change. After I stripped down to my white briefs, I stepped into the dress, put my arms through the sleeve holes, and shivered at that forbidden thrill I'd only known about secondhand, of being a man in women's clothes. I'd grown up seeing such men, had even worked with a few when I was a child actor in the Philippines, those bakla a staple of slapstick comedies on TV and in movies. But while my culture tolerated bakla, nobody ever took them seriously, so I wasn't interested in being like them. But maybe because I knew I could dress up as a girl if I wanted to, I also didn't really find the idea particularly exciting. Not until I got to America and noticed how men dressing up as women seemed so much more taboo than it did back home. I was able to zip the dress up most of the way as it stretched to encompass my back, muscular from pull-ups at the gym. The neckline scooped tastefully in front and was bordered in a shiny material, maybe satin, which I didn't notice from afar. I looked down to observe that the dress ended a couple of inches above my knee and had a slit on one side. I remembered a woman in a talk show say that every girl needs a little black dress in her closet. This was the kind of dress she must have meant. I hate you, Lucy said when she came back into the room and helped me zip up the rest of the way. This looks way better on you than it does on me. As Lucy looked through her jewelry box to see what might work with my outfit, I recalled the moment a few years earlier. I must have been 13 when my cousin Baby walked in on me as I was about to put a shirt on in front of our old wooden house's only mirror, attached to a weathered armoire. You have a woman's waist, she observed as she brushed her palm down to my side to demonstrate how my body curved in below my rib cage and then back out toward my hips. I smiled into the mirror at my cousin's compliment and felt an echo of that pleasure with Lucy. Your hands are so dainty and small, my friend marveled, as she held one and slipped a gold bangle through my fingers. I looked down and noticed that my hand was indeed smaller than Lucy's, though that was only because I was Asian. My hands weren't particularly small by Filipino standards, but people judged my body differently in America, especially someone like Lucy, who didn't know I was albino. We sat on the bed as Lucy applied gray eyeshadow to my lids with a tiny padded brush, then used a stick whose end reminded me of a spider's legs to rub the tops and bottoms of my nearly white lashes with mascara, a cosmetic item I hadn't even known existed until that moment. She ordered me not to blink even though my eyes started to water, and I felt the heavy thickness of the substance when she was done. Lucy complimented what she called my Cupid's bow before she uncapped a black tube of blood red lipstick and rubbed it against my lips. She stood up and looked under piles of papers on her desk until she found a gold and black hair ornament she called a barrette and affixed it to my short hair right above my forehead. You're almost ready, she said. We just need some pumps. Lucy gave me a pair of narrow black shoes made of plastic that was as shiny as the velvet of my dress was matte, with heels that tapered at the bottom, a couple of inches high. When I stood up after I put them on, pleased that they fit, I also found that I didn't have as much trouble walking in them as I expected. Lucy led me back to her common room, where she opened a closet door where she opened a closet door. With a flourish of her hands, she motioned me toward the mirror on the other side. When I ambled over, I realized I was looking down because I was afraid to fall, so I tilted my head upward to see myself. Not bad, I said. I didn't look nearly as ridiculous as I expected. Come on, you look great, Lucy countered, and I smiled to please her, grateful she took so much effort to get me ready. Lucy's suite was in an entryway near the dining hall, and as we walked downstairs toward the gold room, the vestibule before the main eating area that was literally painted gold, I came upon a few guys wearing dresses. In makeup and wigs, the thick hair on their faces and arms looked out of place, their movements clumsy as they loomed above me despite my heels, which clattered on the emerald tile floor. Whoa, you look like a real woman, Kit Clark observed as he greeted me in the gold room. It's almost too convincing. What do you mean, too convincing? I asked. Drag is supposed to be ironic, he replied. You just look like a girl. I understood what he meant when Zach and his friends did their It's Raining Men number that night and wore ridiculous blonde wigs as they sashayed and stomped on a makeshift stage in the middle of the dining hall, fingers splayed and wrists bent. Other men performed classics like I Will Survive and more recent top 40 hits like Express Yourself with that same ludicrous air that felt designed to make fun of women. Still in my outfit, I went clubbing with some gay friends after dinner who let me hang around because we were all queer and at Harvard, even though none of them gave me the time of day romantically. There was a Central Square club called Man Ray, whose liquid night on Saturdays catered to a mixed crowd, and, befitting the name, people were encouraged to gender bend. I'd gone there a few times in shiny tops or spandex bell bottoms, but this was the first time I'd bent my gender all the way. It was amusing to see curious looks from men who gave off straight vibes as I danced with bands like New Order and Pet Shop Boys throughout the night. Though my feet started to hurt after a while, I enjoyed the way my heels made my butt wiggle as I walked out of the club. I didn't have the money to take a cab, so I left shortly after midnight to catch a T before it closed and ambled down the brick pavement of Mount Auburn Street toward Adams after I got out at Harvard Square. I hadn't had anything to drink, but even so, I was afraid of tripping because of the brick, my heels, the tiredness of my feet. I also realized it had been a mistake not to bring a jacket. It was an unusually warm fall night, but the temperature had turned chilly over the last several hours, and I had to hug myself for warmth. I was about a block away from my dorm entrance when I became aware of a rumbling sound, unusually close to the sidewalk, then the honk of a horn. I kept walking, figuring the noise had nothing to do with me. But as I got closer to my house and the street got quieter, I began to hear yelling from several young men. "Turn around," I heard one of the voices say. I paused and swiveled my head in their direction, where I saw figures so dimly lit they looked like shadows, crawling by in a giant, early model American car. "Hey, beautiful," someone from inside yelled. "Come ride with us," another said. I smiled and shook my head as I rested a hand on my cheek. "Not tonight," I replied, my voice suddenly breathy and high. I observed my thickened eyelashes back before I turned around. It was only when I started walking again that I felt the sting of fear. I consciously pieced together what my instinct had already computed, that these young men had mistaken me for a woman, and I played my part to appease them. I also became aware that if one of these men had decided to get out of the car and examine me more closely, they would realize the mistake they'd made, and that this would make them angry, maybe angry enough to use their fists, and that it would be my body and not just my heels against the bricks. A deep part of me knew that running might incite them to chase me, and the safest choice was to walk at an even pace. I was just half a block away now, and instead of their shouts, my mind tuned in to the outlines of my world, the rectangles in the ground that were barely red in the darkness of that hour, the thick white lines of a crosswalk in the distance. Lucy had lent me a black beaded clutch, and when I finally got to my dorm entrance, I fumbled for the clasp before I was able to fish out my keys, the ones I had a hard time getting in the keyhole because of my weak eyes. I had learned to unlock the door by feel rather than sight. I brushed the hole with a trembling finger, then tried to fit my key into the slot for seconds when each gust of wind felt like a man's breath, every failed jiggle like a trap I couldn't get out of. I turned myself into a ghost like I did as a child, without a body and free of fear, when my mother beat me or left me locked in my room overnight. The voices of those men, so loud only a few seconds before, sounded as if they came from the other end of a long tunnel, slippery as I tried to crawl out. Finally, my key found the hole, and I clicked the latch above the handle with my thumb, then opened the heavy door as fast as I could. I ran into a wall of fluorescent light and was suddenly afraid my broad shoulders would give me away. I hurried down the hallway and out of sight, started to climb up to my room as my heels made an almost clanging sound when they reverberated on the circular stairway. I only felt safe once I closed the door to my suite, as physical sensation returned to my limbs, and I realized how much my feet hurt. I went to my bedroom to take off my shoes, relieved that my roommates weren't there to see me. I felt ashamed somehow to have attracted attention and then gotten so scared. I returned the incident to a good story at brunch the next day, how some straight guys followed me home because they thought I was a hot girl. But that night, I just wanted to live with the fear and shame on my own, without the need to transform my experience into a witty anecdote. I sat on the bed and took off my heels, rubbed my feet as I reflected on how tired they were, how nervous I still was, as my palm gripped my chest and I felt my heartbeat slow to a normal pace before my fingers relaxed. Yet as I recalled my fear, there also grew in me a surprising, pleasant sensation, and I smiled despite myself, fascinated at the sudden feeling that the experience had been worth it. Those men were convinced I was a woman, and I became curious about what they saw. I left my bed and crossed our empty common room to look at myself in the bathroom mirror. But my face was too hard, the fluorescent light too harsh up close. So I took a step back, and then another, and then a few more, until I only saw my face as a sketch whose details my imagination could fill. The colors were more pronounced than I was used to, my eyes and lips outlined in smoke and red. I noticed the pleasant semicircle of my dress's neckline against my chest and imagined graceful clavicles I couldn't see. Though I did see that my neck was thin and long, something I'd never paid attention to before. All evening, people had told me I looked like a real girl, and those anonymous men had given me proof. But it was only then, in that bathroom mirror, that I perceived a glimmer of what they saw. From afar, I felt like a girl to myself, even a beautiful girl. I gazed at that reflection and imagined my face as a woman's face, holding features in my mind that others had told me were feminine. My high cheekbones, pouty lips, small nose. I grinned to myself at the thought of my nose, which I pulled on since childhood, hoping it would grow, since Filipinos preferred sharp, protruding noses. But I realized that my nose was dainty on a white woman's face, as I also became conscious that, of course, it was a white woman's face I imagined in that reflection, one of those vivacious ballerinas who thrilled audiences night after night, or the heroine of a 19th century novel. Though as I began to walk toward my reflection, more and more of my masculine features came into focus, my broad shoulders and strong jaw, my prominent brow and high hairline, receding slightly at the corners. By the time my hands touched the sink's cold porcelain again, I couldn't help but perceive myself as a man dressed as a woman, a fool who would have been laughed at and beaten up had those men looked at me close in the light and found out the truth. I felt the immediate urge to rub off the makeup, but something stopped me, and instead, I leaned even closer toward my reflection. I suddenly remembered that I didn't always think of my face as a white person's face, how it took years to convince myself that I was not the aberration other people wanted me to be, but was instead practically the same as the Americans I'd watched on TV. I also recalled how this was not the first time I'd seen a reflection and imagined myself as a white woman with golden hair. I didn't realize the prologue was that long. I think I only have time to read the prologue tonight. But rest assured, there are adventures in store for little Meredith, little albino kid Meredith, who becomes a child star in the Philippines.
That's fantastic, Meredith. And I'll invite folks to either raise their hand and I can unmute you, or you can post things in the chat here. And while people are doing that and getting there, I wanted to sort of follow up something, Meredith, that came up in the masterclass. We were talking about condensing time and sort of how much like when people tell stories from their lives, just in casual conversation, people who are writing memoir might elide certain facts and combine certain details to make it work. And I'm struck by how, like, particularly hearing you reading it, how epiphanic the ending of this prologue is, how like rooted in the idea of an epiphany it is, as if this is a turning point in your own sort of consciousness here. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, like, was there that one moment where you had sort of the beginnings of all these realizations? Like, is this a moment that you recalled because it was indeed transformative in that way, or did you choose to tell this moment because it was a vehicle to articulate a more gradual sort of realization or epiphany?
That specific moment, the end of that section, that specific moment was one moment. Yeah. What's interesting is that the previous scene, like with the drag show, I realized actually, like after the book was published, was a little bit less of one moment, just because Lucy and I were still friends and we were conferring. And she was just like, oh no, you borrowed the black dress junior year, and sophomore year you borrowed a different dress. Apparently I wore a different dress sophomore year, which she doesn't remember any details about it, except that the dress that I was describing was apparently the dress that I borrowed junior year, right? But that was so clear to me, how odd. Even then, I thought to myself, how strange it is that, that, like, I think it was just because they were the first strangers who like interacted with me actively. And so that moment has always like stuck in my mind. But then when I was writing the book, I thought to myself, how strange it is that, and I'm always attracted to those moments where there's like, like a tension or like a, or like a contradiction, that somehow, how strange it is that I was simultaneously deeply, deeply frightened by these men, while at the same time they were also the people who first kind of like indicated to me some sense that, oh, like people who have no idea who you are, who have never met you before, you can just put on a dress and makeup and you would be perceived as a girl, right? Like that was something. And over the course of, of like the next year, that just gave me permission to, and also like Adam's house was like the artsy house at Harvard. So like we had, so like you were always, I didn't realize this was the beginning of my sophomore year, but basically like you were just always allowed to dress and drag whenever you wanted, whenever you were in the house. And so I had like a bunch of, I had the experience of meeting Seamus Heaney in drag. This was, speaking of, poets in the room will appreciate this, because he was actually like living in my entryway sophomore year, and we were introduced at a party and I was in drag, and the housemaster was like referring to me as a boy and like, like referring to me with he pronouns, and he just like, the look on his face, like he was just like super, super confused. So there's a scene in the book about that. But yeah, he was super sweet regardless.
Yeah, we don't want to turn this into a Seamus Heaney love fest, though we could, because that makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
Let me see, I see Leah has her hand up and I have successfully muted you. Hi.
Hi, this was just delightful. I guess I am regretful that the prologue has so much, but also, I mean, you just sold another copy, because that was a delightful introduction.
Thank you.
And I want to make a quick plug for the students in the audience, that there is a history course. I think this could be offered next spring. It seems right up this alley, and I wish Philip was here to hear this, because it seems like such a fair. Seems like an excellent piece with his course on women and gender in Asian history. Or I'm sorry, that's the old title: Women, Gender, and Sexuality in Asian History. If folks are finding this fascinating.
Amazing.
I'll put that there.
Thank you, Leah. And we do have another question from the chat as well, from Briar May. Hi, Briar. It says, obviously your book is more than a witty anecdote, which is a moment that I noticed as well, Briar, where it seemed like a very self-aware commentary on the narrativization of this event in a narrative you had made of the event, right? So obviously your book is more than a witty anecdote, but I'm wondering how long you let yourself sit with these stories before you told them and then started to write them down.
That's a really interesting question. I have, like I write a lot, and I write for no reason at all. Like I'm not, and so over a period of time, like these stories have appeared in, like in my journals, or, like I've talked about them to people. But by the time that I wrote my memoir, I had already, like I had written dozens of personal essays, and, and op-eds, et cetera, that incorporated my personal experience. And one of the things that I realized is that, like in a sense, like I'm fortunate, because I'm a person who, when you meet me in person, it's very important for me to be like put together, and just sort of like, and for people to perceive me as this sort of like, oh, like emotionally, like fully, like actualized human being. I've become more vulnerable over time, but I think that's there's still like a remnant of that in my personality. So writing, I feel like, is how I can be my complete vulnerable self, like is a way for me to expose parts of myself that are very difficult for me to show, like in actual life, which is part of the reason why, I'm just like, no, don't talk to me about the book, friends and family, unless they bring it up first.
Absolutely, that is fantastic, and I'm gonna do my brief little spiel here at the end of our time. I'm just mindful of our time, but if anyone had one last question they wanted to throw in the chat or raise their hand, we would certainly welcome that, and we also welcome shout outs to other commenters. The first thing that I will put in the chat right here is a link to Buffalo Street Books. It's a direct link to Meredith's book, Fair. So if you are interested in purchasing a copy, we can encourage you to purchase it from our sort of local independent bookstore down here in Ithaca. And I will do one other plug for the next Visiting Writers event is coming hot on the heels. It's on Monday. We have poets Andrew Zawacki and Joshua Harmon reading together. And that is Monday night at 7. And wherever you heard about this event tonight, you will see the Zoom link for that as well in the same place. Meredith, it's such a treat hearing your prologue, and I wish we could have heard more. And there's so much more that I wish we could talk about. If you have just a minute, I was struck in particular in the prologue about how the intersectionality of your project was very visible there from the get-go, and I'm sorry, I was asking a question and then, Briar, did you have a question? Leah is sending me private chats and then suggesting that you do, but if not, I can do it. So my question that I was, there you go, Briar, did you have something?
Go ahead and do yours first, and if we have time, we can get to it. I'm sorry.
You're more important than me. Listen, we've heard me so much. You go.
I was going to ask, I couldn't find the raise hand button. That's why Leah was trying to do the kindness of raising the hand for me. I was going to ask, so if you don't, if you're more shy and private about having your family and friends read your manuscript, who were your readers? Who did you work with?
Oh, that's a good question. I have a writers group. So other writers understand the dilemmas, so there's definitely, other writers, mainly those were the readers. My husband read the book, relatively early in the process, but my husband is like a very specific type of person who is like, who engages with work in a particular way. So I wasn't particularly concerned about him. But I think, what's really interesting is that I don't mind people reading my book. Like, they can read my work as much as they want. It's just that I mind when they try to talk to me about it without me bringing it up first, without me being in the, so it's just like, yes, like you can know all these things about me. And as long as I don't hear about it, that's totally okay.
That's fantastic. What I was wondering about, actually, and thank you, Briar, for asking that question. I was thinking about in terms of the intersectionality of your work. I know that a lot of people who have written about their personal experiences when they come from, say, a marginalized population in America, are often expected to like speak for that and like in some senses like looked at with an extra critical eye from members of that community, right, saying you didn't represent us well, that sort of thing. Your story is so very specific, right? There's not. Did you experience any of those sorts of pressures from any of the different populations who might feel some sort of stake in your larger story?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think by the time that I started the book, I had already like done all of my due diligence in terms of like writing extensively on trans issues in terms of like doing investigative pieces that involved, you know, like Filipino subjects, like writing on immigration and labor, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like in that sense, I had a wide berth in terms of, you know, just being like, this book is for me, you know, like this is my perspective. Just because I think that, you know, I think that the pressure of respectability is in itself a form of oppression, right? The pressure to somehow sanitize your experience in order to make it palatable, not just for people within your community, but for people outside your community as well, is a burden that people, you know, from non-marginalized backgrounds don't have to carry, right? And I think that, and I think that it really affects, especially in a context where also, you know, the things that we find interesting are things that are unique, the things that are, you know, the parts of our lives that are deeply felt and not, you know, and deeply considered. And I don't think there's a way to do that unless you have access to all of your experiences rather than, you know, rather than having parts of yourself cordoned off, right? And so even though, yeah, like even though there are parts of the book that are certainly, you know, controversial, like not normative, you know, like not the way that, you know, that the communities usually talk about these issues. So far, nobody has really, at least nobody has done it publicly or in a publication.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate the sort of the sensitivity and attention and like honesty and thoughtfulness of this. And it's been a real delight to hear you read it and to chat with you a bit. So thank you again, Meredith, for joining us. And thank you everyone for coming.
No, thank you. It was really wonderful. And hopefully I'll, you know, get to meet you in person someday.
I would love that.
You know, when we can.
Please, at some point soon. But in the interim, thank you everyone for coming. Have a wonderful night. And thank you again, Meredith.
Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.